When Elon Musk pays a surprise visit to one of his Tesla factories at night, he meets George the janitor. What George says to Elon changes both of their lives forever when Elon does something incredible in response. The Tesla factory at night was a symphony of precision and quiet determination. Machines clicked and whirred in rhythm as workers carried out their tasks with a practiced efficiency. Under the faint hum of fluorescent lights, the Fremont facility buzzed, but with none of the chaos typical of such operations. Elon Musk, dressed casually in jeans and a black t-shirt, moved through the vast expanse, his sharp gaze scanning every detail. Tonight was one of his unannounced visits. No formalities, no red carpets. These were the moments he valued most, when he could observe the pulse of his operations, unfiltered by presentations or scripted tours. Near the quieter end of the factory floor, a man worked diligently with a mop, wiping down the gleaming surface around an assembly area. The janitor moved methodically, his posture upright, a focus in his expression that matched the engineers building the machines. Curiosity struck Elon, and he veered off his path. "Evening," he called out, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. The man looked up, startled at first, then relaxed upon recognizing the familiar face. "Evening, Mr. Musk," he replied, his tone steady but polite. He rested the mop against a nearby wall and straightened his back. "What's your name?" Elon asked, extending a hand. "George," the man replied, shaking Elon's hand firmly. "George Bennett." "How long have you been with us, George?" "Since the beginning," George said with a small smile. "When this plant reopened under Tesla, I was one of the first hires. I started in maintenance, and I've been here ever since." Elon nodded, impressed. "That's a good run. Night shifts must be tough, though." George shrugged. "It's quiet. Gives me time to think." Elon leaned casually against a nearby workstation. "And what do you think about?" George hesitated for a moment, as though debating how much to share. "Mostly about my daughter. She's in college, studying engineering." Elon's eyebrows lifted. "Engineering? She must have gotten that drive from you." George chuckled softly. "Maybe. I used to be in manufacturing myself. Did a little bit of design work too, back in the day. But things changed." Elon caught the flicker of emotion in George's voice. "Changed how?" "Well," George began, his voice steady but tinged with weariness. "I had a good job at a smaller firm, designing parts for assembly lines. But when the recession hit, the company shut down. My wife got sick around the same time, and I had to prioritize taking care of her and my daughter. The bills didn't stop coming, so I took whatever work I could find. This janitorial job came along, and it kept the lights on. I'm grateful for that." Elon listened intently, his expression unreadable. "And your wife?" he asked gently. George's gaze dropped momentarily. "She passed a few years ago, cancer, but she fought hard. She always believed in me, even when I felt like I'd lost my way." For a moment, the two men stood in silence, the hum of the factory filling the space between them. Then Elon spoke, his tone lighter. "Sounds like you've been through a lot, George. And yet, here you are, working hard, raising an engineer. That's impressive." George smiled modestly. "I just do what needs to be done. My daughter, though, she's the real star. She's got a full course load and still finds time to tutor other students. She wants to work in renewable energy someday. Says she wants to make the world a better place." Elon's lips curved into a faint smile. "She sounds like someone I'd like to meet." George chuckled. "Maybe one day. For now, I just need to make sure she gets through school without worrying about money too much. That's why I'm here." Elon nodded thoughtfully, the gears in his mind already turning. "Well, George, it was good talking to you. Keep up the great work." George picked up his mop, his face brightened by the unexpected conversation. "Thank you, Mr. Musk. I will." As Elon walked away, his mind lingered on George's story. It wasn't just the man's resilience that struck him. It was the quiet determination to keep going, not for himself, but for his family. Elon knew he'd just met someone extraordinary. The following evening, George Bennett arrived home just after sunrise, his joints aching from the long night shift. His modest apartment, tucked in a quiet corner of Fremont, was sparsely decorated but neat. On the small kitchen table sat a stack of unpaid bills, a reminder of the balancing act he had been performing for years. George poured himself a cup of coffee, the scent filling the air as he stared at the bills. He'd always found a way to make ends meet, But it was getting harder. His daughter's tuition alone was enough to make him lose sleep, but he refused to let her carry the burden. As he sipped his coffee, a framed photo on the counter caught his eye. It was of him, his late wife Clara, and their daughter Lisa. The photo had been taken at a park on a rare day off long before Clara got sick. Clara's voice echoed in his mind, clear and encouraging as if she were still there. "We'll get through this, George. You'll see. Lisa's going to do great things one day." He smiled faintly. Clara had always believed in him, even during their hardest moments. Losing her had been the most devastating chapter of his life, but her unwavering optimism had left an indelible mark on him. It was her belief in him, and in Lisa, that kept him going. Lisa was his everything now. She had inherited Clara's determination and kindness, combined with a sharp intellect that often left George in awe. As a little girl, she'd spent hours building makeshift machines out of scrap materials George brought home. Now, as a college student, she was thriving in her engineering program, balancing academics and tutoring to help other students. Still, the financial strain loomed large. George hadn't told Lisa the full extent of their situation. She believed the janitorial job was enough to keep them afloat. But George had been quietly picking up extra shifts, sacrificing his sleep and health to ensure she stayed on track. As he sat at the table, George's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and saw Lisa's name. "Hi, sweetheart," he answered, his voice instantly lighter. "Hi, Dad? Did I wake you?" Lisa's voice was warm and full of energy. No, George lied. "Just having my morning coffee. How's school?" "It's going great. I aced my thermodynamics exam," Lisa said, excitement evident in her tone. George felt a swell of pride. "That's my girl. I'm so proud of you." "Thanks, Dad, but I couldn't have done it without you. You've always supported me, no matter what." "That's what dads are for," George replied, his chest tightening at her words. They chatted a bit longer before Lisa had to rush off to class. As George hung up, he stared at the phone, his mind drifting back to his brief conversation with Elon Musk the night before. George had never expected the billionaire CEO to stop and talk to him. Musk's curiosity had seemed genuine, and George couldn't help but feel a spark of hope from their exchange. Still, he reminded himself not to read too much into it. Musk had likely forgotten their conversation the moment he walked away. But Elon hadn't forgotten. Back at Tesla headquarters, Elon sat in a meeting, only half listening as his executives discussed quarterly projections. His mind kept wandering back to George's story, his resilience, his quiet dignity, and his unwavering dedication to his daughter. Elon had built Tesla on the idea of challenging conventions, pushing boundaries, and empowering people to dream bigger. And yet, here was a man who embodied those values in his own way, working tirelessly behind the scenes to ensure his daughter could reach her full potential. As the meeting dragged on, an idea began to form in Elon's mind. He wasn't sure where it would lead, but he knew one thing. George Bennett's story wasn't one he could simply walk away from. Elon Musk was a man of action. Once he latched onto an idea, there was no letting go until it was fully realized. George Bennett's story had struck a chord with him, and by the time his meeting ended, Elon already had a plan in motion. The next evening, Elon returned to the Fremont factory unannounced, much like before. He scanned the factory floor until he spotted George near the loading bay, tidying up a storage area. Approaching quietly, Elon cleared his throat to get the janitor's attention. "Mr. Musk?" George said, startled but quickly recovering. He straightened up, his mop in hand, soared. "Good evening. Didn't expect to see you again so soon." Elon smiled. "Good to see you too, George. I've been thinking about our conversation." George tilted his head, confused but intrigued. "Oh? You've been with us since the beginning," Elon began, his tone direct but warm. "That's impressive. But what really stayed with me is what you told me about your daughter. She's studying engineering, right?" George nodded, a glimmer of pride in his eyes. "Yes, sir. Lisa's in her second year now." Elon pulled a sleek envelope from his pocket and handed it to George. "This is for you and Lisa." George hesitated, his calloused hands shaking slightly as he took the envelope. He opened it carefully, revealing a letter and several documents. As his eyes scanned the pages, his brow furrowed in disbelief. This is a scholarship," George stammered. "A full scholarship?" Elon nodded. Tesla is setting up a new program to support employees' families who pursue higher education, particularly in STEM fields. Lisa is the first recipient. George's throat tightened as he tried to find the right words. Mr. Musk, I don't know what to say. This is more than I could have ever imagined. There's more, Elon said, cutting through George's overwhelmed silence. I read up on your background, George. You're not just a janitor, you're an engineer. I want to give you the opportunity to use those skills again. How would you feel about joining our design team? We're always looking for people with hands-on manufacturing experience. George's jaw dropped. You mean, you want me to work in engineering again? Elon nodded. Only if you're ready. I've seen people like you before, dedicated, hardworking, and resourceful. That's the kind of mindset we need at Tesla. For a moment, George stood frozen, the weight of Elon's words sinking in. He thought of the years he'd spent pushing his dreams aside, the countless nights of mopping floors while others worked on the designs he once loved creating. And now, here was a chance to reclaim it all. Tears welled in George's eyes as he extended his hand. I don't know how to thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet, Elon said with a grin. You've earned this, George, but you've got a lot of work ahead of you. George chuckled, wiping at his eyes. Hard work is what I do best. The two men shook hands, sealing the beginning of a new chapter in George's life. As Elon walked away, George clutched the envelope tightly, a renewed sense of purpose coursing through him. Later that night, George called Lisa. Her reaction was a mix of disbelief and joy as he explained the scholarship and his new position at Tesla. For the first time in years, George felt like he could finally breathe again. Across town, Elon sat in his office, reviewing plans for the scholarship program he had hastily initiated. The gesture was small in the grand scheme of things, but it wasn't about the cost, it was about the ripple effect. George Bennett's story was one of quiet strength and resilience. And now, thanks to one conversation and one bold decision, the ripples of that story were just beginning to spread. George Bennett was no stranger to hard work. For years, he had been content with the routine of his janitorial job at Tesla, finding comfort in the predictability of it all. But today, standing at the door of Tesla's engineering department, he couldn't shake the feeling of inadequacy that threatened to overtake him. This was it, the new chapter of his life. He was no longer just the janitor. He had been given the chance to be a part of something far bigger than himself. Yet, as he stepped through the door, his heart raced. Surrounded by engineers, most of whom were younger than him and well-versed in the tech world, George couldn't help but feel out of place. The tools, the blueprints, the software, all of it felt foreign to him. This was the real world of innovation, where failure wasn't just a possibility, it was a constant. The first few days were overwhelming. His new office was pristine, filled with sleek devices and endless projects, and yet George couldn't stop comparing himself to the brilliant minds around him. These were the kind of people who designed the cars and technology he admired from afar. What was a janitor like him doing here? He sat at his desk, staring at his screen, feeling the weight of imposter syndrome bearing down on him. His hands shook as he typed in commands, struggling to keep up with the pace. Each time he made a mistake, he felt the sting of embarrassment. He wasn't supposed to be here. He didn't belong. Hey, George, came a voice, pulling him from his spiral of doubt. A young woman with dark hair and a friendly smile leaned against the doorframe. I'm Ava. I saw you were working on the Model X design yesterday, and I thought maybe I could help you out with the CAD software. It's a bit tricky if you haven't worked with it before. George blinked, momentarily taken aback. You're offering to help me? He asked, still incredulous. Ava shrugged, stepping into the room. Of course. We're all part of the same team, right? I know it's a lot to take in, but I can walk you through it. I've been using CAD for years. It's no big deal. The kindness in her voice, the genuine offer of help, made something inside George relax. He wasn't used to people offering assistance, especially not in such a high-pressure environment. He nodded, grateful, but still unsure. Thanks, he said. I'd appreciate that. Over the next few days, Ava took George under her wing. She patiently explained the complexities of the software, walked him through the blueprints, and even showed him how to troubleshoot the issues he was having. As the days passed, George's confidence began to grow. Ava's encouragement became the anchor he needed to stay afloat. But even with her help, the feeling of inadequacy didn't fully fade. There were moments, especially during meetings, when George still felt like he was playing catch-up. The engineers around him spoke in jargon he didn't always understand, and he often found himself nodding along, pretending to follow. Then one day, Elon Musk himself walked into the department, his presence commanding attention. He wasn't just the CEO of Tesla, he was an icon, a visionary who had built this company from the ground up. George's heart skipped a beat as Elon made his way to him, a small smile on his face. "George, how are you settling in?" Elon asked, his voice calm and measured. "I'm getting there," George replied, feeling a twinge of self-doubt creep in again. "It's a lot to take in. I'm trying my best." Elon nodded thoughtfully. "I know it's tough in the beginning. I remember my first venture, starting from nothing, not knowing what I was doing. But you know what? The most important thing is persistence. The more you keep at it, the easier it gets." George stared at him, surprised by the honesty in his words. "But how did you not give up when things got hard?" Elon shrugged. "I had a vision. I wanted to change the world, and I knew there would be obstacles along the way. But you keep pushing through, and eventually, things fall into place." Something about Elon's words resonated deeply with George. It wasn't just about the job or the project. It was about the journey, about finding a reason to keep going when everything seemed impossible. Elon's visit was short, but it was enough to spark something inside George. Later that day, he completed his first design on the CAD software, something simple but crucial for one of the Tesla models. He looked at the screen in awe, realizing that for the first time, he wasn't just following orders. He was part of something greater. That night, as he spoke to Lisa on the phone, George couldn't help but smile. "I think I'm starting to get the hang of it, kiddo," he said. "That's awesome, Dad." Lisa's voice was full of pride. "I knew you could do it." George's heart swelled with a sense of accomplishment. Maybe he hadn't yet found his place in this high-tech world, but he was no longer just the janitor. He was learning, growing, and most importantly, he was proving to himself that he had the strength to change. The future, once clouded by doubt, now seemed full of possibility. Do you think Elon did the right thing? Was George just in the right place at the right time? Let us know in the comments, and if you want more heartwarming stories, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more. Have a blessed day.